Welcome. Today we're going to evaluate the 6 trigonomic functions at given reference angles. So let's get our notes out and we'll get going. Remember, during the video, if you fall behind, you pause the video and get your notes caught back up. And if you didn't quite understand something the first time, rewind the video and listen to it again. Sometimes it takes a couple times through to understand the concept. Okay, let's take a look. The past couple days we've been working on the unit circle, learning how to build it. And we took some notes on 6 trigonomic functions. Today we're going to learn to evaluate given reference angles tied to the unit circle. Alright, so our problem is going to be evaluate the 6 trigonomic functions at angle 7 pi over 6. So go ahead and write that down. And ideally, we would have the unit circle to get our coordinates right in front of us, and it'd be quick and easy. But we're going to learn today how to do it without a unit circle in front of us, nor do we have to draw one every time we evaluate. Okay, so quickly going over the steps. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the angle given to us, and more than just looking at it, we're going to relate it back to the first quadrant angle. Step 2 is identify the quadrant. What quadrant is the given angle in? Because if I know the quadrant, I know the signs on what comes next, my coordinates. So the whole idea is to get to the coordinate. So we need the angle and relate it back to the first quadrant angles. Identify the quadrant so we can get the sign on our cosine and sine values or coordinates. And lastly, we're going to use those coordinates to evaluate the function. Alright, let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so first thing we're going to look at is the denominator. Our denominator here tells us what first quadrant angle we're looking at. This is a pi over 6 angle, and a pi over 6 angle is associated with a first quadrant angle. So here's my thinking bubble. Pi over 6. Okay, I know that the coordinates for pi over 6 are the square root of 3 over 2 and 1/2, but if you don't know that, you're going to have to do your triangle and find them. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Okay, step 2, so identify the angles of pi over 6, and the quadrant 7 pi over 6 will be our third quadrant. So I'm going to go ahead and draw coordinate plane here, and scratch one out quickly. There's our x, there's our y, and our circle would be coming through something like this. And since this is pi, and we're dealing with pi over 6, I'm going to call this 6 pi over 6. It's still pi, it's just 1 pi in the form of denominator 6. Okay, this is 7 pi over 6 is 1 pi over 6 beyond this. So I'm going to draw out my radius. You know, this distance is a pi over 6. I can make my right triangle again. Being that's our pi over 6 angle, or 30 degrees. I know this side is the square root of 3 over 2, so this is nothing new. If you don't have it memorized, this is how we find it. The adjacent side of 30 degrees is 1/2, which means our coordinates will be, let's erase that, our coordinates are going to be, our sine value, or x value, is going to be the square root of 3 over 2. And our y value, or sine value, again cosine sine, will be 1/2. Okay, because we're in quadrant 3, we know that both cosine, or x, and sine, y, are negative in this quadrant. So again, we identified the angle, pi over 6, we related back to first quadrant angle, so we could find these coordinates, and if you didn't know them, we identified the quadrant and used our triangle to figure out the coordinates. Okay, let's go on to evaluating the functions at 7 pi over 6. So we're going to need these two coordinates. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and scratch our coordinates out up here. This is the negative square root of 3 over 2 and 1/2. And now we're going to find the cosine of 7 pi over 6. Now we learned from definition, cosine is just our x value, so we have it. It's the negative square root of 3 over 2. Sine is our y value, so sine of 7 pi over 6 is simply 1/2. Tangent we learned of 7 pi over 6, we learned it was just our y over our x, or our sine divided by cosine. So I'm going to take my y value, which is 1/2, and divide it by my cosine value, which is negative square root of 3 over 2. Now I wrote 1/2 here and here because when I transferred it over, so be very careful, I forgot my negative sign. Remember, we're down in quadrant 3 where everybody's negative. So let's go back and make sure we make our sine -1/2 and our tangent -1/2. All right, with simple division of fractions, this is -1/2 multiplied by the reciprocal of -√3 over 2, which is 2 over the square root of 3. We can see that our 2's will cross cancel out, and this will equal negative times a negative is a positive, 1 over the square root of 3. And we can't have a radical in the denominator, so we must rationalize. So multiply top and bottom by that denominator. I'm going to write my answer here. So square root of 3 times itself is simply 3. 1 times square root of 3 is the square root of 3. So there's our tangent. So we have our cosine, sine, and tangent. Okay, we also studied that the other three were the reciprocal functions, and they're just simply reciprocal of the trig function they're paired up with. So our cosine, which is negative square root of 3 over 2, so the secant of 7 pi over 6, which is related to cosine, is the reciprocal. So that's negative 2 over the square root of 3. We're simply just flipping it. Okay, but again, we must rationalize. So I'm going to simply rationalize by multiplying again by the denominator. So that's negative 2 square roots of 3 all over 3. Now we have our secant value. Okay, cosecant is paired up with our sine value, and I love the sine one. That's a quick, easy reciprocal, no rationalizing. That's simply negative 2 over 1 or negative 2. Just the reciprocal. Cotangent, I could take the reciprocal square root of 3 over 3, but I know I would have to rationalize, so I'm simply going to go by definition. Cotangent was x over y, or cosine over sine, so I'm going to go that route. Just a different way to do it. Cosine, or x value, over our y value. Again, simply invert and multiply because they're fractions. And we're going to simply see our 2's will cancel out. The negative times the negative is a positive. So this is simply the negative square root of 3 over 1, or negative square root of 3. Okay, this concept we use to figure out or evaluate our trig functions works with any of the reference angles given. We use 7 pi over 6, but it'll work with a pi over 4 or 2 pi over 3. It's just understanding the steps. So let's go back and quickly review. Remember, it's about identifying the angle. Okay, it means related to the first quadrant angle because the whole key is finding these coordinates. You need these two coordinates. So identify the angle, relate it back to a first quadrant angle so you can get the coordinates. If you can't remember the coordinates, remember, you can use a triangle to find them. Step 2, identify the quadrant. Why? So we can get the right signs on our coordinates. And after that, it's simply taking our coordinates and evaluating the function. Okay, jot down any notes you might have, and hopefully this will help you with your exercises.